Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. In this episode, Tim and I, PRI's Director of Communications, and I have a conversation with Harry Crocker, Executive Editor of Regnery Publishing. PRI has a long history with Harry Crocker and Regnery. I met Harry when we were both speechwriters for Governor Pete Wilson in the early 1990s. When Harry moved on to Regnery, he published Sally Pipes' first commercial book, The Truth About Obamacare, and later, The Pipes Plan. We chat with Harry about his new book, Armstrong, a historical fiction on the adventures of General Custer. Had he survived the Battle of Little Bighorn? The author of several history books, we also chat with Harry about how political correctness in the classroom has wrongly influenced students' perceptions of the heroes of America's history. Finally, we chat about the state of the conservative book publishing business. We think you'll enjoy this. Welcome to Next Round with PRI, Harry.
Well, thank you.
So, some of our listeners might know that my name, Rowena, is from the novel Ivanhoe by Walter Scott. So Lady Rowena ends up getting her man, Sir Ivanhoe. It's a love story, even though Ivanhoe had a bit of a crush on another character called Rebecca. William Thackeray always thought that Rebecca was far more deserving of Ivanhoe than Rowena, so he rewrote the ending so that Rebecca instead ended up living happily ever after with Ivanhoe. And he called his new book Rebecca and Rowena. That's sort of what you did here in your recent book, Armstrong. Custer actually survives the Battle of Little Bighorn. So how did you get this idea for the book?
Well, I have to say, I didn't think about it very much. It just all of a sudden came to me one day, and I don't just mean the idea of him surviving, but actually more or less the whole story. It just sort of popped into my mind. What if Custer survived, and what if, this happened and that happened? And I just started to run with it because I thought it was fun.
Harry, I know you've written several excellent history books. Why did you decide to choose historical fiction in this case? I
was sort of burnt out on real history. The advantage of writing real history is that you know what's going to happen next. I'd done, maybe 5, 6 history books, more or less based around military history. A couple books in the Civil War, one on the British Empire, which is mostly focused on a lot of battles and generals. And likewise, I wrote a history of the Catholic Church, which is basically a history of crusaders and conquistadors, just very, very military-minded. And I thought, I've sort of done that. I've done all of America's wars. I just done a book on the 100th anniversary of World War I, and I wanted to do something more fun. And my first novel was a book about a British general called The Old Limey, and I thought, let's do an American. As a boy, I had always admired Custer. I was one of those kids who actually could map out the Battle of Little Bighorn. And I love Westerns. And I thought the Westerns were a neglected genre these days. And though the book is sheer comedy, sheer adventure, I will say I did have in the back of my mind a somewhat more serious goal as well. That was, I do think that a lot of the history that young people get, especially today, is really agitational propaganda. And it pains me to see a sort of just a disregard or a complete vicious, actually, misunderstanding of American history. When I was growing up, it was easy to have a real sort of natural patriotism because you watched all these old Westerns or these old shows, all of which just assumed that the conquest of the West and America's manifest destiny, these are all, wonderful things that made up this great American story. And nowadays, the left, to a frightening degree, has taken on this sort of iconoclastic war against American history. And even Custer, I didn't know this actually I'd written the book, but Custer was actually briefly featured in a TV ad. This was only last year by that fast food chain Sonic. The ad ran for all of a week, and it was a completely harmless ad. It was these two guys in the car. One of them is dressed up as Custer, and there's this little interplay between the word Custer and custard. There's some sort of mistaken word choice. But the ad was pulled, and it was pulled because the very image of Custer, or the mention of his name, was considered controversial because he fought India. And I thought, if we keep going down this sort of, this identitarian sort of political road, we're going to deconstruct all of American history. And so again, I don't want to freight this book with too much baggage, but I will say that beneath all the comedy, beneath the page-turning adventure, which I hope it is, and you can read it purely at that level, there is actually some real history in this book, and there is a real subterranean, well, there's several subterranean messages, but one of them is to just try to restore the sense of American history as a great adventure story that has I don't know if it's a happy ending now, but was a triumphant. It was how the West was won, which I think is probably a controversial universal to say these days. You can't really quite say how the West was won, how the West was stolen.
I was interested in your writing process and things that you may have looked to when coming up with your idea. Custer surviving the Battle of Little Bighorn. It's a little bit of alternative history. I know that's been vogue these days with The Man in the High Castle is the most famous example. The new season of that's coming out pretty soon, and it's one that I enjoy watching. Did you look to any alternative history books, or what inspired you when coming up with this idea for this story?
I was just looking to entertain people, and that's bluntly honest. I was not looking to. I wanted to make the book so fast-paced that no one would get bored. You have to keep turning the pages, and to make it funny. And though it's alternative history in a way, but another way it's not. The book is not about, wow, what would have happened in some sort of big historical sense if Custer had survived. It's much more of a takeoff point for a series of comic adventures, but they're based in history because Custer's one of those figures, kind of like Teddy Roosevelt, maybe, who is a walking caricature of himself. Because just as you can, Roosevelt's got the big teeth and the big glasses and is saying bully all the time. Well, Custer really was this image you might have of him, of this dashing cavalryman with the long, flowing blonde locks who's outrageously brave and is sort of a cavalier. That's all true. That's how he really was. And so the book takes actual aspects of Custer's character and actual aspects of his history. The history, background history of his life, as related in the book, is all true. But his personal characteristics are taken and exaggerated just a wee bit for comic effect. So Custer really did have a sort of St. Francis-like rapport with animals, and that's taken to comic effect in the book. He really did have this famous romance with his wife, which the entire book is written as a letter to his wife, Libby. Libby lived to a ripe old age. She died in 1933, if I remember rightly. Custer, of course, killed in battle in 1876. She was a widow that entire time. She never remarried, and she devoted the rest of her life to keeping alive the flame of Custer's reputation. And even this whole, Custer, I know, in part of the public imagination is tarnished by that movie, that Little Big Man, and other sort of leftist portrayals that want to show him as this maniac, irresponsible, arrogant representative of American chauvinism. Custer, in fact, was A, a man who served the United States his entire life, B, a man of immense loyalty to his friends, to his wife, to his country. C, a great guy. I mean, when I was reading all these books about the Civil War in the past, I kept being struck by what a good guy Custer was. Custer famously graduated last in his class at West Point. But he graduated last in his class not because he was an idiot, not because he was stupid, but because he was a prankster. On the very day he was to graduate from West Point, he actually viewed his fellow graduates parading across while he was in the brig. He was in prison. He was court-martialed. He was court-martialed because shortly before graduation, he found two cadets brawling. And instead of breaking them up, as he should have done as an upperclassman, he decided to referee their fight to make sure it was a fair fight. So he didn't actually graduate with his class, but as soon as he served his little brief time in the brig, he graduated straight from West Point to the front lines in the Civil War and rose rapidly because he was a very gifted cavalry officer. He was very gifted at reconnaissance. He was very gifted at reading land. He was very gifted at analyzing enemy dispositions. Generals like McClellan, who was one of his patrons early on, recognized these talents in him, recognized how courageous he was, and he was the boy general of the Union Army. But at the age of 23, he was a brigadier general. He ended the war as a major general. And another striking thing about him, here you have this war that kills 600,000 plus people. That is a total war waged against civilians in the South. So it's pretty bitter stuff. And yet Custer, at West Point, was a great friend of many Southern cadets. And he actually liked the South. He liked Southerners. During the war, he attended a wedding of a former classmate who was a Confederate officer in Virginia at a plantation house. The Confederate officer was dressed in Confederate gray. He turned up in his Union blue. And he stayed around for like a week afterwards flirting with the Southern belles, who wasn't married yet. And he had that sort of attitude throughout the entire war. So he would fight, he was as great a cavalry commander as Jeb Stuart. He actually bested Jeb Stuart at Gettysburg. It was the first time the Union cavalry really kind of showed its mettle against Southern superiority on horseback. But he maintained this sort of magnanimity and victory and this idea of knightly, chivalric combat. And after the war, when he became an Indian fighter, I have to say, people think, he committed all this genocide against the Indians. Well, you know what? Just as he admired enlightened Confederates and Southerners, he actually liked the Indians. Some of his best friends when he was in the cavalry out west were his Indian scouts. He loved his Indian scouts, and he wrote, look, if I were an Indian, I wouldn't want to be cooped up on a reservation. I would want to be out riding and hunting and fighting, because that's what Custer did too. Custer was an outdoorsman, and he admired the warrior traits, and he admired that aspect of Indian life. He was also disparaging of some aspects of Indian life, which were brutal or violent, but he was not an Indian hater.
So, Harry, without giving away too much, tell us about an adventure in your book with Custer.
Okay. Well, Custer is spirited off the battlefield by a woman. Actually, she's a white woman who is a slave of the Indians. And he helps her escape from this branch of the Sioux. It's a made-up branch of the Sioux. And through a series of unfortunate events, if you want to call it that, he ends up joining forces with a traveling troupe of lady can-can dancers and Chinese acrobats, and he poses as a Chinese sharpshooter, trick shooter for a short while before he takes on new guys as a marshal. He becomes a fake U.S. marshal and ends up having to restore order to a town, or as a reviewer recently noted accurately, he actually, and this is one of the deeper sort of sub-themes of the book that could easily be overlooked, he actually restores Western civilization to this town, which is known as Bloody Gulch, Montana.
So the last chapter in your book is titled, "In Which I Accept My Destiny as a Knight Errant." And that naturally begs the question, is there a touch of Don Quixote in the reincarnated Custer? We're also wondering, are you going to be writing any more books for this series?
Well, on the more books question, that all depends on how this book does. It's written for a commercial publisher, and they're going to wait to see how the sales returns come in. I would love to. To be honest, I've started it, and it would take him to California. It would take him to meet up with Ambrose Bierce. But that book will only see the light if I can make this first one a success. On the Don Quixote comparison, I have to say that never crossed my mind. But in both novels I have written, The Old Limey and this one, Armstrong, reviewers have, in both cases, mentioned Don Quixote as somehow this book evokes that. And in this one, actually, it was a review by David Limbaugh, Rush Limbaugh's brother, wrote a column about the book, and said he said it reminded him of Don Quixote. And I guess that's because in both cases, both The Old Limey and Armstrong, you are the main character of the book is a military officer of chivalric ideals who, in a sense, is out of joint with his surroundings. In The Old Limey, it's a elderly British general in L.A. who ends up fighting drug gangs. And in Armstrong, you've got Custer having to go incognito because he feels he must have been betrayed into this one blot on his career, this one disaster of the Little Bighorn. And he wants, before he can say I'm alive, he has to find vindication of his not being a coward or a failed officer who led his men into a avoidable catastrophe.
So let's turn to a subject that you often write about, political correctness in the classroom. You wrote in a Crisis Magazine article that the left is teaching that, quote, America's old heroes are false gods from a hateful dark age, unquote. Can you elaborate on this?
Sure. I mean, I think this is, when you think about divides in American politics, I actually just read another piece recently for the American Spectator on this. Rowena, you and I worked for the governor together. When you're trying to rally voters on a campaign, it's actually mostly about turnout. I mean, there are policy battles you fight out and that sort of thing. It's mostly about turnout because people's ideas about politics are already set for the most part, and they're set on the basis of what they think about this country, of what their core values are, chiefly I think about what they think, how you define just. And they want to be on the side of right. And I think right now the great divide in this country is between those who look back on America's history and see it as a story of liberty and freedom and adventure and courage, and those who contrastingly see it as a history of racism, bigotry, and genocide. I think for many young people in the classroom, they're getting that latter version almost exclusively. And I think also for many immigrants to this country, who, if you're taking your clues on what it means to be a good American, either from what you get in the classroom or from what you get in popular culture, you're getting told this tale of, wow, it's this endless attempt to reform an originally flawed America so that people like you, any sort of minority group you want to put yourself in, can prosper. You come here, you respect, you like, you enjoy America's economic opportunities, you value its rule of law, but you really see, gosh, to be a real American is to be a progressive and to get over all this horrible stuff that happened in the past. That, I think, is toxic. I think it's toxic not only because of this identitarian politics that it keeps reinforcing, dividing people, but I think it's just simply bad history too. Now, I say this as someone who's written several histories of Civil War. There is more real history in a novel like Gone with the Wind, or even like Armstrong, but especially Gone with the Wind won a Pulitzer Prize, and deservedly so. There's more real history in that than you will get in most, I think, American classrooms today about this period. And there's a very simple reason why. There's more honesty in that book, and in part because it doesn't treat this as an ideological struggle. It treats it as a human drama. And that view of the war was not just true in my boyhood, certainly, but it was true not long after the war. I mean, you had men like Teddy Roosevelt, who had boyhood memories. And he grew up, his dad could have been called up for service in the Civil War, but didn't go. But his mother was actually a Southerner. But now he was totally on the side of Lincoln. He was totally on the side of the Republicans. He was totally on the side of preserving the Union. He could grant that. And how it is that even the men who fought in that war, men like Custer, could grant this sort of understanding to their battlefield enemies, who would understand that they were fellow Americans, that this was a tragedy. How can we not understand that now? How is it that our understanding of history has not gotten better? It has not gotten more humane. It has not gotten sharper. It has become more and more a matter of ideology which blurs reality, but I also think is extremely destructive. That old line, he who controls the past controls the future, I think is very true.
Our Lance Izumi last year released the book Corrupt Classroom: Bias, Indoctrination, Violence, and Social Engineering Shows Why America Needs School Choice. And he certainly made a few waves with that book. Given his thesis, how do you think we can restore more balance to our public schools and our universities?
Well, it's going to be hard. But I guess there's several answers to that. One is, obviously, the public schools can be, there are school boards. I mean, there's electoral ways to get involved and do this sort of thing. In some places, as in California, unfortunately, that's going to be harder given the Democratic lock on a lot of these elections. But there's that way. I do think that way is necessary. That's not a long-term solution. The long-term solution is winning this argument. I mean, the reason why the left has taken over the universities and taken over the school systems, in part it's by a sort of intent, in part it's because they look after their own. I mean, especially with the tool of tenure, I mean, they can ensure that people who are like-minded staff these places for forever if they want to now. I mean, the conservatives are much more open to the opposition than the hard left is, certainly. But at the end of the day, we're left with two options. We can either, and this is necessary too, support our own independent institutions, your Hillsdales, your Christendoms, your other sort of leaning right sort of schools, conservative schools, old-fashioned schools, traditional schools, try to keep politics in its proper place. But that's, again, a long, hard slog. You're never going to displace Harvard or Yale or Berkeley or any of these other institutions. The only way you're going to reform those places is by a bigger cultural reform or a big cultural battle. Because, again, it wasn't that long ago. I mean, these ideas they were seeded a long time. And if you trace back the history of ideas, you could trace this back a long way. But ultimately, it's going to be about what people think is right? It's all about, at the end of the day, it's all about first principles. And if you really do believe in, believe in free speech, I believe in, well, you name your principles from, say, the Constitution, and then see how it's regarded by most people today. A lot of those people today don't have the same veneration for what we considered in my day American values that I thought were sort of sacrosanct and held by everybody. Well, they're not. And they're not because now we've come to different ideas of what is the most important thing. No, free speech is not the most important thing, many people say, if it hurts someone. Or there are certain ideas that need to be ruled out of the public square. They are just too bigoted to be tolerated. And unfortunately, the lines they're drawing tend to be very narrow. There's an old line. This shows you also how long this problem has been steeping. This comes back from Bill Buckley. Bill Buckley said, and I think this might have been as long ago as the 50s, maybe the 60s. He said, a liberal is someone who will tell you that he's open to all points of view, and then is surprised that there is another point of view. And well, that might have been, sort of a jokey observation back then. Today, it seems to have a big force of law behind it and of real vicious-minded intolerance that I think has got some conservatives fingering their collars.
So, Harry, let's turn to your day job as executive editor of Regnery Publishing. When PRI was founded in 1979, we actually started off as a conservative book publisher, and then later we evolved into focusing on public policy research because we realized that expert book publishers like Regnery can do a far better job than think tanks in publishing books. So what's the state of conservative book publishing today? Are books as popular as ever, or are you seeing some competition from the new media?
Well, when PRI got out of the book publishing business, they made a smart move. Book publishing is a terrible business, and it's getting worse. And it's getting worse for some reasons we can all imagine. I mean, people's attention spans are shorter. They're distracted by endless things. It used to be, I live way out in the sticks in Virginia, or what used to be the sticks. They're building out towards me. They're all around me now. But I'd take a train in to Washington, D.C. And it used to be when you're on the train, you'd see lots of people reading magazines or reading books, and now you never do, or hardly ever do. You see them playing games on their phones. And I think that's the problem. Now, people will tell you that, as many books today are sold as there ever were. That's partly true, but it's partly true because there's a lot more self-published direct out there. And so the actual numbers being sold are maybe close to the same. The average sale for a trade book, a regular commercial book, has fallen. And it's fallen not just because people are distracted, but also think of how many bookstores are around you these days. Borders Books, for people who remember that was, 20, 25% of the market. When it went away, none of those stores were filled by other bookstores. They just disappeared. It was just vaporized. Barnes & Noble, in its quarterly or annual reports, they're never bragging about all the new stores they're opening. They're bragging about how they closed fewer stores than they planned to this quarter. So it's really, really hard, and you can't even make a really successful book. I mean, a book that's really going to break out is not going to be a book that's sold only in bookstores. You have to get into the superstores, you get into Walmarts and Sam's Clubs and those sort of things. And obviously, they only want a small number of titles and a very certain sorts of titles that make it very, very, very difficult. So it's a terrible business, it's a bad business. Conservative publishing is, if you look on the bestseller list, you'll see a few bestsellers that lean right. They are almost, though, without exception, people with a giant media platform. Because if you have a big media platform, you can sort of break through all the noise, and you've got maybe a motivated fan base. But certainly for the sort of books that PRI was trying to do back in the day, or a lot of the more thoughtful books, it's pretty darn hard to get a hearing. If there's any young people listening to this podcast, don't go into book publishing.
I just finished my last book, so I'm looking for some suggestions. So how about highlighting some of the new titles that Regnery is bringing out this fall?
Well, the two that will most likely be commercial successes that you'll probably hear about are a book by Sebastian Gorka called Why We Fight. Sebastian Gorka was a national security advisor to President Trump, and he's got a big following on Fox News. And David Limbaugh has written a lot of books for us. He started writing political books. He's a lawyer. He wrote books about the Justice Department. But he's also an evangelical Christian, a Lutheran, who came to belief from, at best, agnosticism, maybe atheism. And sort of fought himself into it, and I challenged him to write a book years ago called Jesus on Trial, because he's a lawyer. I thought, treat the whole gospel story as you would would a judicial case. And he did, and that book was very successful. And since then, he started going through the other books of the Bible, not just the Gospels, but he went through the Old Testament and whatnot. And now he's done a book called Jesus is Risen, which is his take on mostly the book of Acts, but also some of the letters of the latter part of the New Testament. And he's built up a big following of a layman who can explicate the Gospels in depth, or the whole entire Bible, in depth and lucidly. So I expect that book will do very well as well. We also have a sort of, it's not a one-off, but we had a few years ago, we had a pretty good success with a book called Sergeant Reckless, which was a story about, it was a true life story, history story, about a horse that served with the Marines in the Korean War and actually served heroically. It was actually a statue of Sergeant Reckless now. That author, though, was a great promoter of that book and was wedded to the cause of getting more attention to this horse that was not only a horse but a Marine. And it's done a sort of sequel to that book called War Animals, which is a bunch of stories that are like the Sergeant Reckless story. And I expect that one will do pretty well, too.
So, Harry, finally, our last question. It's a tradition that we ask every podcast guest for a beer, wine, or a cocktail recommendation. So PRI is just a stone's throw away from California wine country, and most everyone loves wine at PRI. So how are you celebrating now that your new book is out?
Well, I love wine too, and my wife is from the wine country. But I thought I'd mix this up a bit because we did have a party to launch Armstrong, and we had a waitress, or a bar. Actually, the waitress is not the right word. She was sort of a saloon girl, who in attendance in full, Western saloon girl attire, who used to work for another, not PRI unfortunately, but another free market think tank back here in Washington. And she came up with a cocktail, Custers cocktail. Now, Custer, in fact, was a teetotaler, and he became a teetotaler actually as part of his romance with the woman who became his wife, because she was from a higher social strata than Custer was. Sure, she was her father was a judge, and the judge had once seen Custer strolling down the street in Monroe, Michigan, rather worse for alcoholic wear. So when Custer realized he had embarrassed himself, he took a vow never to drink again and didn't. So in a way, Custer's cocktail is a bit of a misnomer, but I can say, having had a few of these, they're pretty darn good.
So what's
Here's
in
what
them?
you would do. Take Rebel Yell Bourbon. Rebel Yell Bourbon was selected because of the Civil War connection. And you put in a little barrel-aged bitters, top it up with club soda, and throw in an orange slice, and you're good to go. It's easy, effective, and pretty tasty.
Thanks, Harry.
Sure, my pleasure.
Thanks to our guest, Harry Crocker, and to my colleague, Tim Anaya. You'll find Armstrong and other books by Harry Crocker on Amazon.com. And don't forget to save the date. Our Sir Anthony Fisher Gala in San Francisco takes place on Saturday, November 10th. Our keynote speaker is none other than author and media commentator Mark Stein. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for next round with Pacific Research Institute.